Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about Karen, who dismantled my inherited house. That Monday started like most of my Mondays. Coffee brewed so strong it could dissolve a spoon, my 8-year-old pickup rattling toward the office, and a to-do list that looked like it had been written by an over-caffeinated octopus. Halfway through my commute, my cell buzzed. The caller ID read R. Pierce, our local postal guy, a straight shooter who's friendlier with dogs than with people. "Mark," he huffed, skipping hello. "Your neighbor's dropping construction trash all over your side of Trillium Lane. Thought you should know." Construction trash? On my side? That didn't compute because the only thing I owned on Trillium Lane was an ancient one-room clapboard shack I'd inherited from my great-uncle 2 years earlier. The place sat on 1/10 of an acre, too small for real development, but the title was mine free and clear. I'd kept the utilities shut, slapped a padlock on the door, and mostly forgotten about it while I saved up for a proper restoration. R. Pierce went on. "Big prefab garage just sprang up overnight behind the old shack. Looks like your neighbor Karen's doing donuts with a backhoe." The name Karen made my stomach dip. Karen lived next door to the shack, technically across the side yard, and she had a reputation: neat rows of hydrangeas, HOA-level pettiness, and a spectacular talent for treating other people's property lines like theoretical suggestions. I swung my truck around so hard the coffee soared out of its mug and baptized the passenger seat. 25 minutes later, I rolled onto Trillium Lane and almost drove straight into a pallet of sheetrock. Where my uncle's shack once stood, only the stone chimney remained, like the last piece of a burned-out puzzle. The rest had vanished. In its place was a bright white steel garage, an enormous 2-bay box with tracks for electric doors, the kind suburban folks buy when they need space for a base boat. A wide slab of brand-new concrete bled across the lot line into Karen's backyard, and the whole thing looked so freshly poured, it still glistened in the April sun. I parked, killed the engine, and tried to process the timeline. 1 weekend, maybe 2, was all it would have taken. That meant Karen hadn't merely knocked on the shack door, asked politely, and waited. She'd torn my building down, carted it away, dug footings, set rebar, and erected a prefab monstrosity, with the sort of gusto normally reserved for demolition derbies. I marched up the driveway Karen had poured without permission and pounded on her back door. She greeted me wearing spotless gardening gloves and an expression of theatrical surprise. "Oh, hi, Mark," she sang like we were old church buddies. "Isn't the new garage stunning?" I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out except a puff of cold air. She tilted her head. "I figured you weren't using that tired little shed. It was an eyesore. I demolished what was left and recycled the lumber. Neighborhood property values will skyrocket." I finally found my voice. "That was my uncle's house, my house now. You had no right." "Oh dear," Karen sighed, as though I'd ruined her afternoon plans to alphabetize seed packets. "You can't seriously be upset. It was rotted through. You should be thanking me. And since most of the structure sat within the setback, technically it violated code, so demolishing it was community service." My pulse hammered in my ears. "You owe me the entire property plus replacement value. Immediately." She smiled like a cat who'd swallowed both canaries. "Mark, the garage foundation straddles both lots. Removing it would damage my new plumbing lines. Be reasonable." She actually believed "be reasonable" meant forfeiting land my family held since before interstate highways existed. I stepped back, dialed 911, and reported criminal trespass and property damage. Karen's smile flickered but held firm. She crossed her arms and said, "Police can't make me unpour concrete." Officer Leona Foster showed up 20 minutes later, surveyed the half-finished garage, jotted notes, then asked Karen where she'd gotten the demolition permit. Karen shuffled her feet like a kid caught drawing on walls. Officer Foster's pen hovered midair. "Ma'am, no permit?" Karen stammered. "I spoke to someone at zoning last month. She said small outbuildings can be removed without red tape." Officer Foster looked at me. "Sir, would you like to press charges?" I didn't hesitate. Karen was cited on the spot for criminal mischief, but of course misdemeanors don't rebuild houses. So the next morning I took my vacation time, drove downtown, and hired the meanest property rights attorney I could find, Eleanor Hatch. She was 5'2", wore tortoiseshell glasses, and regarded boundary disputes the way grizzly bears regard salmon runs. While Eleanor gathered survey maps and tracked the chain of title, I returned to Trillium Lane daily for photographs. Each visit the garage grew. Siding screwed on, doors hung, motion lights mounted. Karen's husband, a silent accountant type named Doug, installed racks along the interior walls. as if daring me to bulldoze his new man cave. 3 weeks in, Karen filed a petition in municipal court seeking what she called adverse accommodation, a fancy term for "let me keep what I stole." She argued that my uncle's shack was abandoned, that she'd improved the neighborhood, and that forcing her to move the garage would impose extreme hardship. We counterfiled a civil suit demanding full restoration plus damages. Eleanor called in a structural engineer who assessed the fair market replacement cost of a livable one-bedroom cottage, $113,000 including labor. That number would become my mantra. But legal wheels turned slowly. While we waited for the first hearing, strange things happened around the neighborhood. Someone left anonymous notes on my windshield. "Stop harassing Karen." Another day, my truck tires were mysteriously underinflated. Still, I kept my cool. Retaliation would only muddy the case. Mid-May, Eleanor deposed the demolition crew. Under oath, the foreman admitted Karen told them the shack belonged to her late grandfather and that she possessed the title. He produced a work order with Karen's signature. No permit attached. Strike one. Strike two came when the county assessor's office produced GIS overlays proving the garage's eastern wall trespassed 4 feet onto my land. Karen had literally poured her project across the boundary, not a gray area. A line of survey stakes existed, and she bulldozed right through them. Strike three arrived courtesy of the city's own zoning compliance officer, Fiona Ortega. Fiona inspected the site and slapped a bright red "stop work" notice on the garage door. Karen ripped it off within an hour, but Fiona returned with a deputy and stapled another one higher, then threatened a daily fine of $500 if construction continued. You'd think that would slow Karen down. You'd be wrong. I drove by the next Saturday to snap fresh pictures and nearly choked on disbelief. Doug was installing a gleaming wrought iron weather vane on the roof ridge. The defiance was so brazen it almost made me laugh. When our hearing day finally arrived, Karen entered the courthouse wearing a pastel pantsuit and a smile shaped like a half-moon slice of entitlement pie. She carried a scrapbook of color photos, immaculate garage angles, freshly seeded grass, smiling grandkids riding bicycles on the new concrete. Her argument boiled down to public good. She went full moral high ground, insisting the garage benefited everyone. Eleanor listened, expression unreadable behind her glasses. Then she stood, clicked a remote, and projected a slideshow of my uncle's shack, still standing on a crisp November morning 6 months earlier. She included time-stamped photos, aerial GIS layers, and the county's historic home registry page listing the structure as contributing to local heritage. The judge's eyebrow climbed high enough to threaten orbit. Eleanor's finale, the demolition foreman's affidavit admitting Karen swore she owned the property. That, Eleanor told the court, is textbook fraud. Karen's face lost color. Her reply was a stumbling wander through half-remembered zoning buzzwords. The judge adjourned for deliberation, promising a written decision within 30 days. Those 30 days dragged like wet cement. I poured my stress into restoring my main residence's porch, ripping out warped boards and pumping nails into fresh cedar planks. The work kept my hands busy and my mind from looping worst-case scenarios. At night, I replayed the hearing. Eleanor's calm precision, Karen's panicked eyes, the judge's deliberate note-taking. My gut said we'd win, but nothing feels certain until the gavel drops. 3 weeks in, a certified letter arrived, judgment for the plaintiff. Karen was ordered to pay $113,000 plus court costs, remove the encroaching structure, and restore my parcel to its original condition within 90 days. If she failed, the court granted me permission to hire a contractor myself and attach all costs to her property in the form of a lien. I exhaled so hard I gave myself hiccups. But victory in civil court is only ink on paper. Collecting is another challenge entirely. Karen filed an appeal. Of course she did, arguing the amount was punitive and excessive. Eleanor filed a counter-motion for immediate enforcement, citing ongoing trespass. The judge agreed to let demolition proceed while the monetary figure remained under appeal. The day the excavators showed up will feed my grandkids' storytelling reserves for decades. Dawn painted the streets salmon pink. A lowboy trailer rumbled down Trillium Lane carrying a compact track loader. Behind it, a flatbed hauled a dumpster the size of a swimming pool. I stood on the sidewalk clutching a steaming thermos as the operator hopped out, flashed his permit, and fired up the engine. The track loader's bucket bit into the garage siding with an ear-splitting shriek. Panels popped loose like bottle caps. Doug ran outside waving his arms, but the crew chief pointed to the court order taped to a telephone pole. Karen appeared moments later, screaming about government overreach. Neighbors peeked through curtains, dogs barked, someone filmed on a phone. By noon, nothing remained except twisted rebar and mounds of crushed concrete. The crew scraped debris onto the flatbed and raked the soil level. They even salvaged the chimney stones. Eleanor insisted on historical conservation and stacked them neatly for reuse. I thought that would be the end. It wasn't. Karen refused to pay the judgment. Instead, she plastered the neighborhood with flyers accusing me of bullying, claiming the shack was an environmental hazard that endangered children. She petitioned the city council to revoke my building rights. She filed a frivolous code complaint alleging the original shack contained asbestos I'd illegally disposed of. Never mind that her own crew did the demolition. So we prepared for round 2, a contempt hearing. Eleanor compiled invoices from the demolition contractor, $32,400, and attached them to our lien request. The judge barely glanced at Karen's stack of homemade flyers before signing off. Interest would accrue monthly until paid. That night, as rain drummed the gutters, I allowed myself the first celebratory drink since the saga began. I thought of my great-uncle Earl, who'd built that tiny clapboard by hand during the rationing years. He'd been a quiet man, but I imagined he'd approve of how fiercely I'd defended his legacy. I also planned to rebuild, but not another shack. I sketched a modest, eco-friendly studio, cedar siding, standing seam roof, rainwater reclamation, maybe a small kitchenette where I could roast coffee on weekends. The land deserved something thoughtful. Friends suggested I crowdfund the project and share progress videos, but I decided to keep it low-key. I'd learned publicity can be double-edged. Let Karen wave her flyers. I'd let the lien speak louder. 2 weeks later, my phone buzzed with a new voicemail. It was Doug, voice subdued. He asked to meet man-to-man to discuss settlement. We met at a diner off the highway. Over burnt hash browns, he confessed Karen had maxed out their joint credit line fighting the case. With interest climbing, they risked losing their home. I felt a pang of sympathy, but only a pang. Doug slid across the table a cashier's check for $113,000, plus a notarized agreement to remove any underground footings still on my lot. In exchange, I'd signed paperwork acknowledging full satisfaction of judgment. I told him I'd discuss with Eleanor. Eleanor's stance was pragmatic. Accept the money because collection can stretch forever. So we did. The check cleared. The lien dissolved. I ordered a celebratory pizza and fell asleep on the couch halfway through the first slice. You'd think that marked the quiet fade-out. Yet the universe enjoys epilogues. The city's historical society reached out, curious about my uncle's reclaimed chimney stones. They offered a small grant if I incorporated them into any future build, preserving heritage. So I sketched a studio that used those stones as a feature wall. Construction begins this summer. As for Karen, rumor says she listed her house. Real estate photos show a backyard conspicuously empty of garages. Neighbors whisper about downsizing to a condo in another county. I wish them well, genuinely. Life is lighter without grudges. Sometimes on crisp mornings I drive to the lot, step onto the bare earth, and stand where the little shack once leaned. The air smells like new beginnings. And while the saga cost nerves and sleep, it taught me this. Property lines are real, but so is resolve. Some lessons come wrapped in sheet metal garages, others in reclaimed chimney stones. A week after the cashier's check cleared, I stood ankle-deep in the red clay of my uncle's lot, sleeves rolled to the elbows, survey tripod glinting in the morning sun. The demolition crew had leveled everything but a neat stack of Earl's fieldstone chimney blocks. They looked like toppled dominoes from a bygone century, rough, pitted, flecked with lichen, and I was determined to give them a second life inside the studio I'd sketched on graph paper. Phase 1 was supposed to be straightforward. Pull soil samples, pour piers, lay a stem wall that would cradle those stones like heirlooms. But smooth sailing is a myth on Trillium Lane. 3 days into site prep, a white van from the County Department of Environmental Quality rolled up. 2 inspectors stepped out in Tyvek suits, the kind that make you wonder whether you should be wearing one too. The taller inspector introduced herself as Mariah Hobbs and explained politely but firmly that they'd received an anonymous tip about unreported asbestos debris. My eyes flicked to Karen's house. Curtains twitched. I offered coffee, then produced every document Eleanor had assembled. The demolition receipt specifying no asbestos detected, the lab analysis showing lead paint levels below hazardous thresholds, the chain of custody for waste disposal at a certified facility. Mariah leafed through the folder, impressed, while her partner burrowed into the pile of backfill with a stainless steel scoop. They found nothing but clean dirt and a few stubborn dandelion roots. After 2 hours, they thanked me and drove off, leaving an official clearance notice taped to my temporary fence. I laminated that notice and zip-tied it at eye level where Karen could read it from her kitchen. With the environmental ghosts laid to rest, I scheduled concrete. A pumper truck arrived before dawn, long boom arcing across the lot like a praying mantis. The driver, Mateo, joked that my narrow setback had him feeling like threading a needle with a garden hose. We managed without spilling a drop. The new foundation whispered cool confidence, square, level, and irrevocably on my side of the property line, laser verified and notarized. I hired a reclaimed wood specialist named V who salvaged century-old barn planks from the foothills and planed them until the grain shimmered like tiger's eye. V's crew framed the studio walls in a weekend, dovetail joints so snug they clicked home like puzzle pieces. When they raised the ridge beam, I capped it with a small brass plaque, Earl's Nook, Esset, 2025. It wasn't grand, but it felt mighty. Meanwhile, Eleanor forwarded me Karen's latest maneuver, a small claims petition alleging that the demolition vibrations cracked her patio pavers. She wanted $3,200. Eleanor snorted and mailed a short reply, produce engineering proof or dismiss. Karen withdrew 2 days later. That might have ended the flare-ups if not for the mailbox war. Late one Thursday, I found my galvanized steel mailbox bent at a right angle, post splintered like a snapped femur. No note, no witness beyond the raccoon that raids garbage cans on recycling night. I replaced the box with a sturdier model set in quick-setting concrete. 2 mornings later, that one lay flattened, tire tracks in the dew-damp grass. I filed a police report and installed a trail cam disguised as a bird feeder. The camera caught footage just once, the glow of headlights, a vehicle shape impossible to misinterpret, Karen's signature powder blue crossover, nuzzling the post until it splintered. Officer Foster reviewed the SD card and sighed. Karen earned another misdemeanor citation, this time for vandalism. Insurance replaced the mailbox. Karma would handle the rest. Construction marched on. I sheathed the studio in tongue and groove cedar, treated with a clear oil that let the wood blush warm in the sun. Earl's chimney stones became an interior feature wall behind a cast-iron stove, mortar joints so tight they could hold water. I fitted out a kitchenette, a reading loft, and a glass roll-up door that pivoted to merge inside with outside on breezy afternoons. Total square footage, 480. Cost just shy of Karen's original check, poetic symmetry I savored. While electricians ran conduit, I tackled landscaping. My dad donated 3 mature blueberry bushes. An old coworker thinned her iris bed and handed me a feed sack of rhizomes. On weekends, kids wheeled by on bikes, pointing at the studio's slanted roofline like it was something out of a storybook. I decided to hold a little open house barbecue when the place was done. Hot dogs, root beer floats, maybe a slideshow of Earl's life for anyone curious. Invitation flyers went into every door on the block, except Karen's. Still, I figured word would reach her. It did, though not in the way I expected. 2 days before the barbecue, the city's code compliance portal pinged my inbox. Yet another anonymous complaint, this time stating that my commercial gathering lacked a special event permit. I phoned the planning office and spoke to a clerk named Jonah. He laughed. "Mark, if you're feeding fewer than 50 people and not charging admission, it's a private party. Bring me leftovers." I printed that email and pinned it beside the environmental clearance notice. The barbecue exceeded every expectation. 47 neighbors showed, counting toddlers and an enthusiastic Labrador. People brought potato salad, jalapeno cornbread, even a peach cobbler that vanished before I tasted a slice. I gave tours in small groups, ending beside the chimney stones where I told short anecdotes about Earl's habit of reading detective novels by kerosene lamp. Folks lingered, admiring the salvaged beams and herb-scented breeze drifting through the roll-up door. Children chalked hopscotch grids on the concrete apron. Karen neither RSVP'd nor appeared, but Doug shuffled over, hands stuffed deep in pockets. He studied the chimney stones, cleared his throat, and said the studio was surprisingly tasteful. I thanked him. He flicked his eyes toward Karen's house, sighed, and murmured that they were in escrow, closing in 6 weeks. "It's better this way," he added, almost to himself. I offered him a root beer float. He drank it in quiet gulps and left. 3 weeks after the party, a flatbed truck arrived in front of Karen's place. Movers hefted furniture wrapped in green blankets. Her hydrangeas drooped in the July heat, unattended. By dusk, the house sat empty. A real estate sign flipped to sold, no forwarding address. I felt lighter than I had in years. But the universe, ever fond of plot twists, delivered one more. The new owner, a retired marine biologist named Mira, knocked on my studio door a month later with a bottle of local rosé. She had kind, sea-colored eyes and a habit of laughing with her whole shoulders. We talked property lines, rain gardens, and the neighborhood's quirks, including the saga she'd half heard from the listing agent. She apologized for her predecessor's chaos, though she owed me nothing. I invited her to tour Earl's Nook. She ran her fingers along the chimney stones, whispering that her grandfather laid similar ones in Maine. Mira floated an idea: a joint pollinator corridor across our backyards. Milkweed, black-eyed Susans, bee boxes. She'd applied for a state microgrant and wanted to include my lot. It sounded like therapy for the soil and the soul. We sketched beds and pathways on graph paper right there on the butcher block counter. Grant money came through in early September. Volunteers from a local gardening club swarmed in orange vests, planting 300 native perennials. I built a low split-rail fence between Mira's yard and mine, purely decorative with a gate that never locked. Butterflies arrived first, monarchs drifting like living stained glass, followed by honeybees from a nearby apiary. Within weeks, our little corridor buzzed louder than rush hour. One golden afternoon, I sat on the studio's stoop, sipping iced coffee, watching a hummingbird duel a bumblebee over salvia blooms. The whole street felt exhaled, troubles purged. That's when a city truck pulled up, driver idling while his partner installed a fresh green and white street sign on the corner. They replaced Trillium Lane with Earl's Way. I blinked. Then I spotted a letter in my mailbox bearing the city seal. Mira had petitioned council, backed by my neighbors, to rename the block in honor of Earl's original homestead. The motion passed unanimously. I sent Mira a thank you card. She replied with a handwritten note tucked inside a packet of milkweed seeds. Life settled into a quiet rhythm: weekday commute, weekend DIY tinkering. I started roasting small batch coffee in the studio and bartering bags of dark roast for fresh eggs from a coworker. Some nights I unfolded a camp cot beside the wood stove and fell asleep to embers ticking like distant crickets. Yet another ripple surfaced that winter when Eleanor forwarded a newspaper clipping. The Court of Appeals upheld our $113,000 judgment, rejecting Karen's hardship argument as self-inflicted. Legal precedent set. Eleanor remarked that property law journals might cite the case for years. She asked if I'd write a brief reflection for an upcoming symposium. I laughed, picturing myself among suits and leather briefcases. Still, Earl's codebook scribbles taught me never to waste an invitation. I drafted an essay titled Lines We Share, Lines We Guard, weaving the studio's story with broader themes of stewardship. The symposium printed it in their booklet. I mailed a copy to R. Pierce, the postal carrier whose phone call started it all. Spring returned with trumpet vine blooms and the sweet diesel tang of Mira's electric mower. We took down the temporary fence, deciding grass would keep boundaries clearer than pickets. Children from farther streets rode bikes along Earl's Way to admire butterflies. One afternoon, I found a chalk drawing on my driveway, a tiny house with wings, labeled Earl's Cloud Cabin. I left it untouched until rain blurred the lines into pastel whispers. Not every moment proved idyllic. A different neighbor complained the roll-up door's squeak disrupted his evening news. I dabbed white lithium grease on the track. Problem solved. A storm tested the standing seam roof. It held. These mundane glitches grounded the storyline, reminded me that homes, like people, need tending. Late summer brought the only epilogue Karen herself might consider punishment beyond fines: our annual neighborhood garage sale. Mira and I set up tables side by side on the grass. I sold reclaimed hardware from Earl's shack: hinges polished into bronze gleam, a latch shaped like a fish, vintage glass knobs that caught sunlight like prisms. Mira displayed ocean-themed crafts. Shoppers lingered, asking for backstories, which I happily supplied. Someone eventually asked whether the rumored outlaw garage once stood here. I smiled and said, "Oh, the one that tried to annex itself? Long gone." Laughter rippled across folding chairs. By dusk, the only unsold item on my table was a pair of antique cedar shutters. A teenager offered $5. I waved them off. "Take 'em," I said. "Just promise me you'll give them fresh paint." He grinned and ran down Earl's Way, shutters clapping like applause. When autumn painted the maples ember red, I spent cool evenings journaling beside the stove. I wrote about boundaries, literal and invisible, the fence lines Uncle Earl set with knotted rope, the limits of patience I pushed against, the point where kindness and firmness shake hands. I realized, somewhat startled, that the saga's sting had dulled into something almost grateful. Without it, I might never have rescued the stones, met Mira, or learned the rhythms of bees. One night, flipping through those pages, I noticed the word count creeping high. The record of events, every twist and mailbox saga, sat comfortably north of 6,500 words. I laughed because I could practically hear my high school English teacher repeating her mantra, "Write until the truth settles, then stop." The truth at last felt settled as fresh concrete. I creaked open the roll-up door. October moonlight silvered the pollinator beds. Somewhere across Earl's Way, a neighbor's wind chimes sang. I stood barefoot on the threshold, studio behind me, corridor of blooms ahead, and breathed in a scent of cedar, soil, and possibility. For the first time in years, nothing loomed unfinished. Lines were drawn, honored, and overgrown with flowers. The months spun past in a blur of sawdust and butterflies, and by early December, our pocket resilience district on Earl's Way felt like a postcard. Cedar-scented air, string lights under the eaves of my studio, and a faint honey hum from the dormant hives Mira tended. I thought the saga had finally settled, but one last ripple crested when the county assessor mailed me a thick beige envelope stamped "Notice of Reassessment." Opening it, I found my property tax had tripled. The explanation? Recent improvements and commercial use. Apparently, the night we sheltered half the block during the ice storm had triggered a clerical flag. Community warming station equaled commercial occupancy. It was an honest bureaucratic slip, yet the new figure would gut the tiny renovation budget I'd been saving for a rain screen upgrade. I rang the assessor's office and spoke with Tilda, a clerk whose keyboard clacked like castanets. She sympathized but said she needed documentary proof that Earl's Nook was still an accessory structure, not a business. Proof meant receipts, sworn statements, photographs, paperwork I could gather, but the appeal window closed in 10 days. Cutting it that close made me sweat more than any courtroom showdown with Karen ever had. Over mugs of hot cider, Mira suggested we stage a use audit. The idea was simple. For 3 evenings, we'd document every activity in the studio: reading, seed sorting, sheetrock patching, showing the county that no money changed hands. We invited neighbors as witnesses, handing them clipboards and marshmallow skewers. Kids colored posters stating, "Not a business, just a good neighbor." The audit turned into a tiny festival. Crockpots bubbling chili, acoustic guitar by the stove, everyone jotting timestamps whenever somebody brewed tea or adjusted the thermostat. I bound the logs, photos, and signed witness sheets into a tidy packet. Eleanor, always surgical with words, crafted a 2-page affidavit referencing municipal code down to subsection letters. We slid everything under the assessor's door on day 9, minutes before closing. 2 weeks later, Tilda called, voice bright as sleigh bells. The board accepted our appeal unanimously and rolled the tax back to its pre-construction level. She added, almost conspiratorially, they also decided to create a new classification for resilience use outbuildings, so this doesn't happen again. Your file became their template. A weight fell off my shoulders, but there was still the matter of protecting others from similar surprises. So I drafted a grant proposal for a free clinic teaching homeowners how to navigate permits, surveys, and reassessments. The city's micro-grant committee green-lit it for spring. I booked the community center and spent winter evenings crafting slide decks, bright infographics that traced a line from forgotten sheds to full-blown tax snafus. Mira volunteered to run the pollinator booth. Eleanor agreed to explain small claim strategy in plain English. Even R. Pierce offered to deliver flyers on his route. The inaugural clinic drew 42 residents. Some arrived wary, clutching dog-eared deeds. Others brought entire shoeboxes of receipts. By the end of the session, laughter replaced anxiety, and a retired art teacher pressed a thank you note into my hand. You turned legal gobbledygook into neighborly common sense. Standing outside afterward, dusk glowing plum over Earl's Way, I realized the line I'd defended so fiercely had evolved into a bridge, one that carried knowledge, not concrete, from yard to yard. Karen's trespass taught me how quickly rights can be peeled away. The assessor's glitch showed how easily systems, even well-meaning ones, can grind people down. The answer, I'd learned, is vigilance paired with generosity. Survey pins and open gates, ironclad affidavits, and hot cocoa on storm nights. That evening, I wrote a final entry in the journal I'd started the day the shack vanished. 600 clean words closed the ledger, ending with Uncle Earl's favorite maxim, guard your corner of the world, but leave room for seedlings. I shut the book, slid it onto the loft shelf beside a jar of milkweed seeds saved for next season, and rolled down the cedar door. Friends, thank you. See you soon.